Okay, welcome all officially. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. I'm Dave Javid. I'm part of the consultant team. You're going to see many of us here tonight. We're here in person for the first time as the members of the GPAC and the community. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to take you through a full agenda. We'll get into that here shortly. Before we get started, we also do have live interpretation available. So I'm going to ask Mariana to give us a quick overview of that in Spanish, just in case there is anyone here. And I also want to let you all know we do have this meeting recorded, which is very exciting. It'll be available as a resource. We have Tectonic here with us, the event planners who've done a great job to get us set up. But before we get started, I'm going to bring up Mariana.
Hola, buenas noches. A los que necesiten escuchar esta reunión en español, lo pueden hacer pidiéndonos, hacia atrás está mi compañera Cristina, unos dispositivos y van a poder escuchar la reunión totalmente simultáneamente en español. Gracias.
We have claps. Excellent. I love that. Okay, so as we typically would do virtually, I'm going to take a quick roll call just to see who is with us here tonight with the members of GPAC. I'm just going to go down the list. Actually, let's see. Do we need this? We probably don't need this on mic. If you want to just raise your hand, say your name, that would be great. I'll go through logistics later of how we're going to do the Q&A, but we'll make this as efficient as possible here. So going down the list, Dave Alden. Here. Welcome, Dave. Stephanie Blake. Stephanie isn't with us. Phil Boyle. Welcome, Phil. Aaron Shumlisky. Aaron. Mary Dooley. Hey, Mary. Jesse Feller. I didn't see Jesse earlier. Allie Gaylord. I don't think Allie's with us. Yensi. Welcome, Yensi. Sharon Kirk. Hi, Sharon. Welcome. Roger. I don't think Roger is going to be with us. Ileana, I saw Ileana. Welcome, Ileana. Roberto, welcome, Roberto. Great to see you. Brent Newhall, welcome, Brent. Chris, hi, Chris. Bill Reinhardt, hi, Bill. Joshua Riley, Simons, no Josh here tonight. Elda, no Elda. Lizzie Wallach, no Lizzie. And last but not least, Bill Walpert. Okay, well, hopefully folks trickle in here. And I welcome members of the public. If you're sitting too far back, you're welcome to kind of come closer to the front as well. So real quickly, just on logistics, as I mentioned earlier, we will have live interpretation available. Hopefully folks will take advantage of that. So we're going to try to speak as slowly as possible so interpreters can pick that up. As well, again, we're having it recorded, so it'd be great if everyone could hear us as it's recorded and will be posted to the website as a resource. This is more for the team to reduce the use of acronyms to make it as easy and approachable as possible. So that's the only other piece I wanted to mention. And then for members of the public, if you did have public comment, and if you haven't grabbed a comment card in yellow, if you want to please grab that and then hand this to me if you have a comment. There'll be a couple sections where we're taking public comment. I'll go through that shortly. Up front as general comment and then item-related comment. And then also you do have a comment form on the back of your agenda. So feel free to write down any comments you like and give that to us at the end of the meeting as well, so that we can make sure that we provide space for you all. This is definitely a focus meeting on the GPAC, so we want to provide you as much time as possible to ask questions. If you had any specific comments, we definitely want to respect those in the public here as well. And we'll mention this a couple times, but there is also a meeting, a virtual meeting coming up for the public on the 27th. So there will be plenty of opportunity for members of the public as well to provide input. So quick overview of the agenda. Obviously, we just did the roll call and logistics. We're about to move into public comment. And again, with the public comment, just to make sure we get it on the recording, I'm going to ask if you can hand me or a member of the team your card, or you can just really bring it up with you. I'm going to ask you to queue up here at this mic up in the front of the room, and then we'll take your comments there. We do have the 3-minute or so restriction, as we typically do, and then we'll kind of go from there. We're going to have a very quick project staff update Brian's going to provide here shortly, just to let you know what else is going on throughout the community and how what we're going to talk about here relates to that. Obviously, the main reason we're here today is to talk about flood and sea level rise modeling and mapping and where we are currently. That is going to be the core of the presentation here tonight. We do have a very robust presentation from you all, and then we're going to move into a Q&A, starting with members of the GPAC to ask any questions that you have at different segments throughout the presentation. We will also have another opportunity for members of the public to come up and ask any questions, and then we'll wrap it as we typically do with GPAC, providing any final thoughts. So with that, we are going to move now into our public comment. So if you had a general comment that is not related to any items on the agenda here tonight, if you want to maybe start by waving your yellow card and or coming up to the front of the room, you're welcome to provide your comment now. Yep, come on up. Thank you so much. I'll take that. Thanks. And then if you want to step up to that would be great, just so we get it recorded.
Hello. My name is Carolyn Lachera, Petaluma resident. And I've never been to one of these meetings before, so I don't really know what you've already been covering. But since it's a public comment, I thought I'd jump in. I found this report, the Petaluma Valley Historical Hydrology and Ecology Study. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but basically it's a document. It's a document which looks at what the Petaluma estuary and watershed used to look like and what it looks like now and how much of it has been lost. So I just want to make sure you have this available because it could be a great resource if we try to expand or recapture that estuary and watersheds for, holding water and helping with flooding. And then at the same time, we could reestablish native plants in that area and help biodiversity. So I don't know who to give this to.
I could take that for you, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Carolyn. I don't see any other yellow cards. And again, to remind you all, we will have another stop for public comment related to the presentation that you're going to hear tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Brian to give us the project updates.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian O. I'm the director of your director of community development for the city of Petaluma. There's a 49ers game tonight. I appreciate everyone's attendance here. Hopefully it's recorded. And just bear with us. We have a really great program this evening. A lot of subject matter expertise. We're excited. This has been a long time coming, so we appreciate everyone's time tonight. So before we jump into the main event, I just wanted to highlight a few other items that are ongoing, and we've been working with our city's Climate Action Commission, and so we're working towards a public draft, and so that's another key piece of information. Our wonderful city has a goal to be carbon neutral by the end of the decade, so that's in about 7 years, and so we have some really exciting actions and ways for us to get a little bit closer to that goal. And so we're looking forward to having a much more public dialogue with everything that we've come up with. And so just a quick little slide. So we're looking to release that at the end of September, and then that'll kick off a much more intensive community engagement process around the plan. And I recognize a few of you that participated this morning. We're also, it's been about a 2-year project, Objective Design Standards. So how do we as a city, envision future multifamily housing developments. There's a number of streamlining and prioritization from the state and from the city to bring such an important piece of our community online. And so as we start to look at more and more opportunities for affordable housing, you're starting to see a lot of cities take a much more objective view on how to evaluate and approve such projects. This might look familiar. It's a couple years in the making, but just north of us, there's a handful of really exciting changes that are upon us. And so we have our second smart station coming online shortly. Smart, which is the owner, they're getting ready to put the construction award out to finally, realize our second station. And so that's something that we're looking forward to and marching towards a brand new station by the end of next year. So lots, that's, to me, it's a catalyst for the north end, east side of the city. $30 million we just secured for a housing project. So this is a rendering. You have the SMART train just on its east going northbound. And so we're looking at over 100 units here of housing with the focus on permanent supportive housing. So something, again, we're really excited about. And over the last couple months, as we have these new opportunities, the train station being one of them, we went out and secured $1.5 million to develop a specific plan. And so how do we take what you see here going north on McDowell, cross-section that runs up to Corona, how do we reimagine how this entire corridor can look? And so that's something that's going to come online and start, the city will start planning over the next year and a half. Okay, so this is about the general plan, and so we did. Many of you have stayed engaged throughout this process from project initiation. We went through a discovery phase, and we've been slowly getting our way. We had a great visioning exercise with the community, and many of us have spent the better part of the year really focused on policy. One of those being how we adapt and be more resilient to an environment that's changing, whether it's related to sea level rise or the types of rain events that we experience as a community. All of that sort of culminating into this large effort, which is, how do we update the general plan? How do we envision the next 25 years, and how do we develop in the next 25 years as a community? And so we're right here at the star, so right in between policy development. And so this is, again, a big milestone. And so wanted to just appreciate the General Plan Advisory Committee for getting us to this point. Definitely more to come, but again, just a milestone worth recognizing here this evening. We'll jump into alternatives, and then we're looking to complete the update itself by the end of 2025. Okay, so today we're introducing, just as Dave said, the flood and sea level rise modeling and maps. So we're going to see a lot of data, and I apologize to our interpreter. There's going to be some acronyms, but we'll minimize that as best we can. And so this is the introduction. This is our in-person version. We're going to have a virtual with similar content next Wednesday before we start to roll up our sleeves and really start to talk about, okay, here's the data. This is how our community is changing. What are we going to do about it? How should we approach this? How do we want to adapt for what's coming? and what is already here. And so we'll jump into flood resilience planning. That'll put us into a nice position to talk about land use alternatives. So we'll start talking about different ways that we can grow as a community and evolve as a community. And then more to come on this last bit, just a little bit more of the working group approach to talking about all the different topics and frameworks. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Dave.
Yeah, just real quick. Yeah, I'll come up. Before we jump in, we typically like to give you all a quick pause here if you had any questions on what Brian just presented about project updates before we launch into the core of the presentation. So members of GPAC, any questions you all might have? Yep, we'll get a mic run out to you. Thank you. It'll come to you. Yep, thanks for your patience. And actually, members of GPAC, if you could just remind everyone in the room your name before you start speaking, that would be really helpful.
Bill Reinhardt, just quickly, I'm wondering if the materials that we see tonight are going to be available to us afterwards, or do we need to be taking notes?
Yes, you don't have to be taking notes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, we are now going to launch into the core of the presentation, why we're all here tonight. I asked you to be patient. There's going to be a lot of information shared with you. If you wouldn't mind, GPAC members, keeping your questions. There are going to be 2 or 3 sections where we'll stop and pause and give you an opportunity to ask questions, but we'd love to give space for the presenters to present the core of the information before you ask your questions, if that's okay with you. You also have the comment cards on the back of your agendas if you want to track your questions there or comments. And then we'll also have, again, a moment for public comment as well before we come back to GPAC and wrap up the meeting. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gina to get us started.
This is really high. Okay, thanks, Dave. And I'm just going to check out this guy. I advance with, got it, okay, thanks. So welcome, I'm Gina Benedetti-Petnick. I'm Assistant Director of Public Works and Utilities here in Petaluma. I'm also the floodplain administrator for the city of Petaluma. And I'm sort of the soft open for what's going to be a pretty engineering heavy discussion. And I'd like to talk about what floodplain management is and why we do floodplain management, kind of the floodplain 101 course here in 2 slides. And then I'll be introducing our consultants and team to take it from there. So starting with the left tag, preparing for the future, that's basically what floodplain management's all about. Floods can happen anywhere, and they can wreak havoc very quickly. It doesn't take a lot of water to make a lot of damage, and I think a lot of our residents here know that too well. We at City of Petaluma are continually working to keep the community safe by minimizing flood risk and damage throughout the community. And so this slide highlights the ways we do that. The top tag here says coordinate with FEMA. We do a lot of our work is related to the requirements we have from FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Protection Program, also called NFIP, and another acronym for the Community Rating System, CRS. It is administrated by NFIP, and it is the program through which we continually, annually, audit for FEMA and the flood insurance program to maintain lower insurance rates for the community. And we do that with education and outreach and floodplain management and the sorts of things that we're doing here tonight. And a lot of other technical things, the endeavors we do with our floodplain and the restrictions and policies we have around development of floodplain and the way we enforce those. So that's part of that FEMA piece. The other thing that we do to manage our floodplain is we use the information that we gather from the data, like you'll be seeing later tonight, to develop projects to respond to those threats, to those risks. And those projects generally, up to this point, have been really focused on managing water flow in the river and in our creeks. There can be more natural solutions as well that we'll be looking at for mitigations in the future. I guess I could highlight real quickly the 3 projects that some of you may be familiar with that do just that and that are implemented, built, and have in fact had a really positive effect on our flood safety here. One is the Payran Reach project. Those are the walls along the river that were put in. It was a U.S. Army Corps of Engineer project that we worked on with them and collaborated with. The Denman Reach project that many of you know in the north end of town, and then Capri Creek was another project to reduce out-of-bank flooding along that creek. So those are some examples of those projects that we do. And with the new information that we've learned and are still refining, there are many more projects that are presenting themselves to us, and we're seeing much more clearly, I think, where our attention needs to go for future projects. And then, of course, the bottom tag here talks to updating our flood models and maps, and that's what we're going to be talking about here very shortly and sharing with you. The floodplain maps have been updated with state-of-the-art modeling technology, much more robust data than we've ever had before, to better understand the flood risks from rain and storms. And then we've added to that sea level rise mapping that we've layered on to both the king tide maps as well as our rain and storm maps. And we've never had sea level rise really modeled carefully locally just for our watershed. And we have it. We have that now, and we're excited to share that information. Let's see here. So the flood mapping process is, this is a nice, simple slide to describe that it's very complicated. It is very locally focused. Again, it's all about our watershed and our river and our creeks. And we've done a technically very rigorous effort that you'll be hearing about shortly, focused on our needs in Petaluma. After we created the model for how rain would fall and how flooding would occur in town, we tested it against real storms, and our modelers call that calibration. So we take the digital model that we've generated from a tremendous amount of data, and it's only as good as it can predict what we have experienced, and so we calibrate it to the floods that we've actually experienced. And that calibration took quite a while. We've been working on this process close to a year. And the calibration has been very successful, and the modeling is very, very close to our historic models and gives us a tremendous amount of confidence in our models as a result. And I think that's it that I want to talk about on this business. I'd like now to briefly introduce our consultants. We've been working with 2 teams of consultants, one from West Consultants and then Sherwood Engineers and Sherwood Design Engineers. And this team has just been pivotal in our ability to develop these models. And the amount of effort, I don't know how many overnights and 24-hour model runs it's taken to get us to this point, but the effort has been much appreciated. West Consultants is represented by Dave Smith, and Dave manages their San Diego office. He has 20 years of experience managing hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, and he has been working with Petaluma since 2005, since before our last general plan. And so Dave will be speaking shortly, and our first up will be our project manager from Sherwood Design Engineers, Sebastian Birch. And Sebastian's firm is, an international firm, but very local too. Sebastian works right here in town, around the corner from us. And they do everything from stormwater management and watershed restoration. And they've done several projects here in the Bay Area. And we have really been fortunate to have these two teams working with us very closely over the last year. So with that, I think I'm going to turn this over to Sebastian. Thanks. You got it.
I think our monitor turned off. But, all right, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. So as you said, we're an international firm, but our main offices are Petaluma, San Francisco, and New York. And we've been involved in the general plan process since the start, looking at flood resilience and water systems and infrastructure. And we're staffing this with our climate resilience team, which is some people in Petaluma, and mostly and with more people in San Francisco, Santa Cruz, and New York. And we've done a lot of projects, this type of flood resilience planning for communities inside the Bay Area and around the country. So Petaluma's a pretty interesting place. We're technically not a river, we're a tidal slough. And what that means is water is moving through our city in two directions. It's a bit counterintuitive. Sometimes it's moving up the river and sometimes it's moving down the river. It's of particularly interest to me because our office is there. So I have a nice window view, but at high tide you go, oh, wow, that's pretty high up there. So the two ways water's moving. When it rains, we've got water moving down the land, goes into our creeks, goes into our river, and it flows out to the bay. That's the way we're used to. But we also have water that comes up the river from the daily tides, and it also comes up from storm surges. So there's a lot of factors that play into the height of the Petaluma River and its creeks. The lower portions of the river are affected by both rain coming down and storm coming up. The upper parts of the river are mostly just affected by rain coming down. So we're at this really interesting interface spot. So there's a lot of different factors you can see here that play into how high is the bay, how high is the river, how high is the water in our floodplain. Luckily, we're not affected by wave swell, so we'll take a win there. But there's a lot of other factors we have to consider. So as rain is falling on the city, it has to work its way through the creeks and the river down to the bay, and it can flood things along the way. So there's rain flooding. We got to deal with that. We also have tides, right? They cycle up and down twice a day, and our highest tides, those king tides, they already have effects on the city. There's other seasonal factors, like an El Nino can raise or lower the level of the river for months. A storm surge off the coast can raise the level of the ocean or the bay and the river for days or even weeks. And we know the big one, we know that sea levels are rising. So these different events, some of them interact, some of them work together, some of them don't. And we have to figure out which ones do we consider together and which ones do we consider separately. And be prepared, we're going to go through all of them tonight. So you might have to take notes, I don't know. So there's three main potential sources for flooding that were considered in this process. And wherever possible, we're using the already kind of industry accepted methods. who else is dealing with these problems? What can we learn from each other? The three main types of flooding are king tides, rainfall flooding, and storm surge flooding. King tides are those highest tides of the year. They happen a few times a year, even with no rain. Blue skies, you'll see that really high level. And they're already a concern. And then, of course, rainfall happens every year, but we really plan around those really big rains, that rain event that only has a 1% chance of happening every year. This is frequently called the 100-year rain event. And so tide measurements tell us how to deal with the king tide. But there's this third type, there's this third type of flooding, this storm surge flooding, most people aren't familiar with. Storm surge is an extreme event where atmospheric conditions like El Nino or Pacific storms or strong winds on the coast or in the bay drive water up the river and into the city. And it's based on a totally different set of conditions than that 100-year rain event. And it can even happen when there is no rain. But the thing is, those two events, the 100-year rain, the 100-year storm, they're almost guaranteed not to happen at the same time. But they have the same chance of happening every year, so we have to consider both of them. So in any year, there's a 1% chance you'll get a 100-year storm surge. There's also a 1% chance you'll get a 100-year rain event. A lot of people don't see that, haven't seen that storm surge idea before because the flood maps we're used to looking at usually merge those two areas together into one big blob. So it looks like the 100-year flood. It's actually made up of these two things because we're in the middle and we've got water coming at it from both sides. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the source. They tell us how high that 100-year storm surge is. So to predict the rainfall, though, how's that going to change in the future? We need to consider all those different variables we are looking at. And it's a really complex process. So what's used is called a flood model. So a flood model is software that generates an estimate of what areas may flood given all these different factors. The key factors are the shape of the watershed. The watershed is that area that all flows down to the river. The amount of rain that falls, where it falls. Then there's the hydrology, the question of how much of that rain runs off the ground and how fast does that water running make it to our creek and down to the river. And then the last one is this question of how high is the river? The higher the river is, the harder it is for that rainwater to get out. So the lower bullet here, we're trying to keep the number of acronyms down, but sorry, I had to throw one in. There's this question of what is the right size rain event to plan for? We don't want to plan for those little tiny rainfalls we get all the time. The common standard is that you use a rain event that's so large, it only has a 1% chance of happening every year. Again, called this 100-year rain event. Rain events can be more intense than that, but they have an even less chance of happening. So that 100-year has been the standard for the city, and it is the standard for most communities. And we'll get into more of that, but I'll hand over to Dave's going to describe how the software flood model was created and the model that predicts what gets affected when we have one of these 100-year storms.
Alrighty. Make sure I got the right side here. There we go. Hi there, Dave Smith with West Consultants. What we want to show on this slide is that we use the best model. The city had previously adopted the use of a model called XP Storm that was in the last general plan. It's an excellent model choice 18 years ago, and maybe even 5 years ago. Recent advances in HEC RAS now make that the model of choice for Petaluma. We're also using features of HEC HMS for hydrology coupled together with the HEC RAS 2D model for hydraulics. So this graphic is illustrating some of the reasons, the basic reasons for moving to the HEC software. HEC RAS 2D does a better job dealing with that flow that gets out of bank into the overbanks, the areas adjacent to the creek channels. The HEC software will allow us to model the entire Petaluma watershed instead of limiting ourselves to the city boundary. While both XP Storm and HEC RAS are used regionally, HEC RAS has a much larger user base and is really considered the gold standard for hydraulic modeling, not only in the US, but around the world. And it's free, unlike XP Storm, which did have an expensive price tag proprietary software. Finally, the HEC software is fully supported by the US Army Corps of Engineers at the HEC Hydrologic Engineering Center in Davis, California. And their team's dedicated to improving the software, and they continually come up with new features and new, very needed elements of the software. So on this side, it looks a little bit like the one Gina just showed us, but the model process was precise and Petaluma focused. This is an illustration of the modeling process. We're using the best model, the RAS 2D, coupled with HEC HMS. We're also using the best available data specific to Petaluma. This includes the selection of rainfall data, terrain data, which is the ground surface elevations, and structural data such as culverts and bridges. During the model process, we really get granular as possible. We walk the streams to determine the roughness values, which are, for heavy vegetation, it's a high roughness value. For paved areas, it's a low roughness value. Of course, we're also using aerial photos and data. For willows, it would be very high. There's hundreds of culverts and bridges in this model. I could probably spend a whole hour just talking about the model and the level of detail. But to quote the British statistician George Box, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so to make sure this model is useful, the model was checked reach by reach for reasonableness and compared with and calibrated to actual events. We selected the 3 largest events of record in Petaluma, including the 2005 New Year's storm. And the point we want to make and to communicate is the model is state of the art and it's going to be useful for your planning decisions. So to back up a little bit, if you're wondering what is hydraulics, what is hydrology? Hydrology is just simply the process of the rain falling and how much the ground soaks up and how much runs off. That's what the hydrologic model gives us. The hydraulics models then tell us how high in the creeks those levels get to. So the two together are necessary. So on this slide, yeah, we're showing some key components of the flood model. Some of this is repeated. I'm going to start in the lower right corner with rainfall. Wes performed a custom rainfall study using data through 2023 to determine how much rain is reasonable. And we'll call that the 100-year flood depth. And then where that rain falls in the watershed needed to be determined. It rains more in the mountains than the low areas. So that we call spatial distribution. And then how quickly it falls over the course of a 24-hour period. We looked at that as well, and that's called temporal distribution. So those 3 pieces together are entered into the model. And moving to the bottom left, we have hydrology and hydraulics. These model components include the terrain, the field surveys, land uses, the vegetation levels in the creeks. And then going diagonally to the top right is the mean higher high tide. This is the starting point for the boundary condition of the model. It represents the highest tide daily over a course of epoch, they call it, like 40-year period. So they take all of those highest tides of the day and they average them. That's the mean higher high tide. So we'll just call that the high tide for simplicity. But keep in mind, it's really the average of those daily highest tides. And this value in Petaluma is equal to 6.35 feet in the 88 vertical datum at the upper drawbridge tide gauge station. This is an important value in the model because the higher tides we have, the more flooding there is upstream when we add the rainfall. And speaking of those higher tides, the other important consideration, which we've been talking about, is considering sea level rise. Sea level rise was determined based on current science, and Sebastian's going to get much more into that in a minute. So this slide is an illustration of the entire Petaluma River watershed. And there's 154 subbasins that were utilized. And this kind of speaks again to the granularity of what we're doing. The subbasins are color-coded by stream. Colors might be a little hard to see. We have Adobe Creek on the far right, and then it moves to East Washington, Washington, Lynch, Capri, Corona, and then you get to the upper watershed, which wraps all the way around, and then we have Kelly and Thompson on the south end. And the upper watershed is nearly half of the flow in the Petaluma River. And in the hydrologic model, a unique amount of rain is entered into each one of these subbasins. And the model computes how much water sinks in and how much runs off. And then those values are put into the 2D model. And this slide is just demonstrating the 2D model, the hydraulic model. The hydraulic model takes that runoff from HEC HMS, and it computes how high the streams and rivers rise, also considering the tide level. So the hydraulic model includes very detailed data describing the ground elevation, structures, bridges, flood walls, the roughness characteristics of the entire watershed. So this is an actual clip from the model. The green areas are low ground. You can see the mountains are the brown. And then the blue is showing where the water is in the model. And to describe how the model was configured to account for those future changes, I'm going to give it back to Sebastian to talk about some more sea level rise.
Don't worry, now we're going to get technical. Speaking of climate change, this smoke is really getting my... Okay, so we use these models, and they're used really frequently for understanding what the current flood risk is. That flood model, it's typically used for putting in the current variables, the current understanding of all these different conditions, and it'll say, what's at risk of flooding right now? But this general plan effort is looking so far into the future that Petaluma wants the general plan to guide how the city is resilient to floods, not just now, but also moving into the future. And there's a lot of factors that might change in the future. So there are some concerns like rainfall or storm surge perhaps getting more intense in the future. Those data sources, the potential for those is not really sufficiently understood at the moment. We're at the cutting edge at this point. And there isn't really a regional precedence for how do you factor in how much more intense the storm might get. And there isn't state or even federal policy to say, consider that the rain gets this more intense or the storm gets this more intense. So they're not really effective tools to utilize them. Other factors were considered, like how much land in the city in the future is going to be covered with concrete and pavement or buildings. What effect does that have on the flooding? Those sorts of things have really serious impacts on certain things. I remember when my neighbor put the building up next door and the downspout was heading towards our place. That was a really significant impact to us. What was interesting was the model actually indicated that in this 100-year storm event, this really intense rainfall, that those changes to how much concrete is in the city didn't actually have that significant of an impact to the flood conditions. And we can talk about that towards the end. It's got other serious impacts that we need to address, but in this really nuanced case, it doesn't seem to be that significant, something the model told us. Sea level rise is a different thing. We know from previous work that it was significant. It's going to be a significant impact to the city. It's really well documented by state guidance, and there's other local precedents for how people are using it to inform these future projections. So we're going to get now into how did we consider sea level rise and how did we work it into our understanding of future flood hazards. So the main source for sea level predictions is a California guidance document. It was developed by multiple agencies and research institutions. It's published by the California Ocean Protection Council. We call it OPC 2018. And it provides this really well-researched and nuanced process to guide sea level rise planning. And a lot of cities, agencies in the Bay Area, across the state, are using it. Sea level predictions were known from previous effort to be really significant, so a lot of effort was put into how do they affect this flood model, how do they affect our other flood risks. So OPC 2018 doesn't just say how much sea level rise might happen in different years in the future, it also says how likely that amount of sea level rise is to happen. And that's really important because it lets us select a really high level of sea level rise for projects or considerations that are very vulnerable to flooding. And it lets us select lower levels of sea level rise for some projects that might not be very vulnerable to flooding, might not be very effective if they flood. So the guidance also lets us consider what might happen in the middle of the century and what might happen in the end of the century, because we want to prepare in different ways. Oh, sorry. So a key assumption that I want to make sure we get out there is what climate change prediction are we using? How bad do we think climate change is going to be? How bad do we think global greenhouse gas emissions will continue to be? It's a really important factor. So based on the state guidance and the guidance from the community and the CAC was that the climate action was that we should assume this worst case where global climate emissions continue to be very high. And so you'll see on the graph here, there's a hopeful case that global emissions stay in this blue area, as in we were able to globally drop our emissions, and sea level rise doesn't end up being that bad. We didn't use that number. We use this red number up here, this higher amount, which says greenhouse emissions continue to be high, which leads to more sea level rise. So we're already factoring in this playing it safe mentality of let's take climate change seriously and let's use really high estimates of how bad it could be. So in the end, what was selected was a value for the middle of the century and one value for the end of the century. And we'll go into how were those selected. So there's a lot here. Let's walk through it. So for the mid-century, let's look at the summary here. Mid-century, it's around 2050. What was selected was a sea level rise that has a very low probability of happening. It's very unlikely. It actually only has a 0.5 chance of happening by 2050. Why did we pick something that's so unlikely? Well, it's because there's not much time before 2050. We don't have that much time to prepare for this possible flooding. So we're using what the state actually said was the least likely sea level rise that might happen. The worst it thinks, the most amount they think could happen. And that is 1.9 feet by the middle of the century. So how do we read this? Here, down here, there's a really high chance that we'll have 0.6 feet of sea level rise. Real high chance we'll get some sea level rise. There's less chance that we'll have more than that. There's only a 17% chance we'll have 1.1 feet of sea level rise. And what we selected was all the way here at the top. There's only a 0.5% chance that we'll have 1.9 feet of sea level rise by mid-century. That's why we call it the very low probability. For the end of the century, the considerations change a little bit. We're talking about end of the century. We have more time to adapt here. We also have to consider that there's also more chance that globally we make good progress on reducing greenhouse emissions. So there's some chance that it's also not this worst case scenario. So for end of the century, we're talking about 2100. You notice we always say roughly here. These projections change every couple years. They fluctuate a little bit. And so we're calling it end of century. We selected what we're calling the low probability sea level rise, not the very low, the low probability. It has a 17% chance of happening by the end of the century, and that value is 3.4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So again, looking here at this chart, there's a very high chance, 96% chance we're going to get a foot of sea level rise. I would look at that and say we're almost guaranteed a foot of sea level rise. As we go up, there's less chance we have 2.5 feet. And up here, here's this, there's a 17% chance that we'll get 3.4 feet of sea level rise. This range in here is what the state said they expect to be likely to happen. And so what we've done is we've taken the maximum amount that the state thinks is likely to happen. There's these higher numbers though, 4.4 feet of sea level, 6.9 feet of sea level. This is what the state says is very unlikely to happen. This number here wasn't just thrown away. The 6.9 foot number is used for guiding certain really critical projects for the city, projects that might have a big impact to human safety or infrastructure. So if you're perhaps building a hospital, you would use an even higher level. So the two main maps that we're using for guiding the planning process is that 1.9 and 3.4. I know, that was a lot. So now that we have those numbers, how do we use them? So we have our two numbers, 1.9 by the middle of the century, 3.4 by the end of the century. Remember, we have those three types of flooding. We've got king tides, we've got storm surge, and we have rainfall. How do we consider sea level rise in each of those? Well, it's pretty straightforward how sea level rise affects king tide and storm surge. But how sea level rise affects rainfall is a little bit more complicated, which is why we had to explain this rainfall map. So let's start with the easy one, which is how does sea level rise change king tides and storm surge? So, like was mentioned before, king tide and storm surge, they can happen without any rain happening. They can happen on a blue sky day. Storm surge probably at least happens on a gray sky day. It's probably going to be cloudy. We consider them independent of rainfall. And so we're not using that model that Dave described. We use a different process. It's a pretty straightforward process. So for king tide, we have our current river elevation. The river is this deep at king tide. And that's our current flood level. What we do with sea level rise is we add the sea level value to that elevation, and this is now our new flood level. And we map that anything below that level is considered to be flooded during a king tide. It's a pretty straightforward process. So really similarly on the right, during the storm surge, we take the current level that the Army Corps tells us. This is the water level that has a 1% chance of happening every year because of a storm surge. And we add the sea level on top of that, and that's our new future storm surge map. We look at everything in the city that's below that, and that's what we think might flood in the future during that storm surge. Rainfall is a little bit more complicated, so we're going to have to use that flood model. So looking down here, the rainfall map considers that high tide Dave was talking about. And what we do is we add the sea level to that. Now we have a new high tide. We have a future high tide. And then we run the model. We add a 100-year rain event, and we see how much extra water has to move and fight against that river to get out. What new areas might be flooded? So, what did we map? Gina's going to be showing you the maps, but here's a list of what you're going to see. So the first two maps are for the middle of the century, using this very low probability sea level rise of 1.9 feet. And overall, the impacts from the rain event and the storm surge that each have that 1% chance of happening have been merged onto one map. We can look at them together. They get modeled separately, but we can show them on the same map because they have the exact same chance of happening. King tides, we're showing them on a different map, just for clarity. They happen without rain and without storm surge, so we show them on their own. And we then do the same thing for the end of century maps. What does the rain and the storm surge look like? What does the king tide look like at the end of the century if we have 3.4 feet of sea level rise? So I'll hand it over now. Actually, before we hand it over to Gina, we have GPAC questions.
Okay, are we having fun yet? Is that enough information to absorb? So we now want to take a pause to give you members of GPAC an opportunity to ask any questions of what you just heard before we roll out the maps to dive even a step deeper into what we're talking about now. And for members of the public, as a reminder, we're going to do that. We're going to show the maps. GPAC will get another bite of the apple to ask any questions. Then we'll go to public comment and then come back to GPAC one last time. So at this point, any members of GPAC have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll bring a mic over to you. Please remember to say your name before you get started. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, Chris Rebelo, just how much warning do we have for storm surges? Do we have any warning for those things?
We're thinking. Do you want to step up, Sebastian, and give it a go?
I have one more question.
That's a really great question. Yeah. So storm surge is caused by these atmospheric conditions, right? A lot of things stack on top of each other to make that really significant storm surge. The problem is that it's really difficult in real time, the week before, to know, well, how bad is that rain going to be? We can model how bad the rain be. We've got pretty good technology for that now. The storm surge is even a little bit harder to predict. How much higher is the base well going to be because of the winds? Some of it can be forewarned because there are tide gauges out on the coast. You start seeing that ocean levels are particularly high this month, prevailing wind direction. I would overall say, unlike a king tide, which is just it's just astronomic. It's just physics. Those you have really good warning when exactly they're going to happen. Rainfall, we have a bit more warning, a bit less warning, but still pretty good because particularly in the last couple of years, the radar systems for predicting rainfall are getting really good. Storm surges, again, you have a little bit less warning for when that happens.
Okay, because I'm just thinking, when we actually get to the actual general plan, do we need to factor in language about preparation and warning and all of that stuff that goes along with this? And then all of the modeling that you've done, I can't wait to see the maps. How often will that be updated? Should that be done every year, every 5 years? Because what you're talking about is incredibly dynamic. And I go, okay, so we're going to do this general plan. We're going to come up with our recommendations, but it's really dynamic. So do we need to keep revisiting this? Does that need to be written into the general plan?
I can speak to one of the parts is about sea level rise. We've been typically getting new state guidance on how much sea level could happen and how likely it is every 3 to 4 years. We're actually expecting an update. You're using 2018, that's the most recent we have. We're actually expecting an update this year. And that might change these numbers a little bit. And so that's one factor I can speak to. That's kind of the cycle of science that we're getting. The other things, you need to talk to the administrator.
Yeah, so there's things like money and political will and logistics. To answer the rest of that question, we would love to be updating these, I would say realistically, every 4 to 5 years. More than that, it would just be like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. It would just be nonstop because it takes that long to do this. So as new guidance comes out, we'll make strategic decisions about when we pull the trigger to do another update. And hopefully we'll have you all on board. So, thanks.
Great questions as always, Chris. Any other questions from members of GPAC before we dive into the maps? Roberto, we'll go to you and then we'll jump over here next. Please remember to say your name.
Do you mind going back a couple charts? Sorry.
I'll let Sebastian, you should probably be up here for this. I'll let you navigate.
It's the one where you have the envelope with the 2 different parameters. Yeah, right there. Do you mind explaining a little bit, I know you kind of touched on it, but a little bit more in detail on the significance of your dashed and solid lines and how they kind of affect, your predictions?
Yeah, so on this graph, we've got, on the bottom is our dates. We're going from, here's our historical measurements of sea level, and we see it going up since 1850 to 2000. And then going into the future, it's a projection. And that's why the color changes, and that's why we have this split. It might be very low. We might only see 6 inches of sea level rise. It might be very high. We might see more than 4 feet. The first off, these two colors, there's this system used internationally called RCP, representative concentration pathway, that says what will the future global greenhouse gas emissions be, and what effect does that have on the climate? And state guidance gives us kind of 2 options. They basically say the blue one is we make serious improvements globally in reducing greenhouse emissions. Climate change is not as bad as we are worried it's going to be because we do such a good job of it. Red says we don't do a very good job about it globally. Emissions continue to stay high. And so the range is actually this likely range. So even with one guess of how much the greenhouse gas emissions might be, there's still a huge range, multiple feet difference between, we think that might make this much sea level and that might make this much. There's a lot of variability. And the farther you go out into the future, you notice the difference between high and low starts getting really big because there's these uncertainties about how the oceans will respond, how the ice sheets will respond. And so this low one is optimistic about globally doing a really good job with climate change. So to be safe, we're ignoring it, and we're looking at what if global emissions continue to be like they are, right? That's the state guidance that says, particularly for mid-century, assume this worst case that we don't get emissions under control. Use those high estimates. The importance of I wouldn't worry too much about the dashed lines versus the dotted lines. That's getting into the statistics of there's this big range, and there's a little chance you'll get tons, and there's a little chance you'll get almost none. And then there's a likely range in the middle of that, of what's probably going to happen. And then there's that median number right in the middle. I wouldn't get too hung up on the difference in the colors. What this got used by the OPC to say, given these amounts of emissions, what's the likelihood of different sea level rise?
Okay, yeah, thank you for clarifying. And then go up one more chart.
Yeah.
Or not that one, one more, sorry. The where you had the likelihood probability. So from right here, when you guys took into account the likelihood of this, how did this compare to the last time this was done? I think you were referencing the last general plan versus, the prediction, I guess, right? What I wanted to see was like, this is what we're looking at now, but last time we did this is what we predicted, to just see how far we were from our current prediction. And I know you said we're using a completely more refined model, but it would be nice to kind of understand where we gauged ourselves initially as we're making this update to see how far off we were from the original time we kind of planned for it. So
I don't have in my head the numbers that were used in 2008. So Pam might.
Pam, did we address sea level rise in the 2008 general plan?
Dave could answer that, but no, we did not.
Nada. Yeah, I didn't think so.
I'll add that since 2008, the general accepted understanding is that if you were to compare what we thought sea level rise was going to be in 2008 and compare it to now what we think it's going to be, we think it's going to be worse now. Pretty much every year as we do new science, the predictions for sea level rise go up.
yeah, that's where I was going to go next. So basically from last time we did to now, there's kind of like, a gap, right? A pretty large gap. And then for the century model, did it include, was it a sum of 1.9 plus whatever to get to 3.14, or is that is the 3.14 in addition to 1.9?
No, good question. It's not in addition.
Okay.
The state guidance says there's a 17% chance we'll get between now and the end of the century 3.4 feet of sea level rise.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Great. And I just want to make sure it's on the mic from what Pam said. The data was not available when the last general plan was done. So just want to make sure that got recorded as well. Yes, please remember to say your name.
Brent Newell. So I appreciate Roberto's comments. They help kind of lead up to what I was going to ask. Going back to the chart we just had, the 100-year, 2100 sea level rise predictions, we've gone from the very low probability for 2050 to a low probability level. And I also heard you say, you know, what we see each year is that the predictions become more refined, the data gets better, and we realize that sea level rise is going to be more severe than what we'd thought 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? So my question is, we're using this 2018 guidance, which is 5 years old. What's your read of the latest IPCC data and the most conservative sea level rise estimates coming from IPCC, and how do those predictions compare to, say, the latest round? Because my recollection is that the IPCC recognized that sea level rise was going to be more severe than the last release of the prior report. So is that fair?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say so. The one challenge is that there's not a great direct conduit from IPC to our level. It needs to go through the state, and the OPC guidance documents is kind of that process.
Right.
And luckily, they should be releasing some updates this year, which what that does is it starts shifting this number a bit.
Yeah.
Maybe this goes up a bit.
Yeah.
One of the things we want to consider here is we're talking about end of century.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about estimates built upon each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that this number will shift a bit. And that's where it's important that for something that's coming up soon, mid-century, we use a really high number, a very low likelihood number, because we don't have much time. If the science says it's going to be worse, we have not many more years to deal with it. Whereas end of century, the difference between our model was needed to be updated, and we're on this, this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more time to adapt to, it's a little bit higher than we thought. And that's the other reason we're trying to, this general plan needs to guide us for its entire life. That's another reason we're trying to think of these things as end of century, not a specific year. No, we're not saying it's going to be this much by that year. We're saying this is the number that we're using, and we know maybe it's 2105, maybe it's 2995, right? It's generally end of century.
Okay. And also my read of the IPCC and other reports of the predictive value that the IPCC is using is that they've recognized that they've been under-predicting some of the effects that have been observed because the climate models have not been conservative enough. So like the real-world data that are coming in are showing that even the estimates that have been used by IPCC, or I assume, the prior iteration of this model, under-predicted what we now are seeing effects of climate change. Is that also a fair sort of summary of my understanding?
Yeah. International Climate Panel on Climate Change, just acronym thing. There's a lot of them. Yeah, I think that's an accurate understanding, and the state guidance from the Ocean Protection Council from California State considers that, which is why it says for mid-century, use the high estimate.
Right.
Do not get optimistic that global greenhouse gas emissions make significant progress in the next couple decades. It's a pretty pessimistic view that we don't make any global progress, but they're saying there's not much time before mid-century. Use this assumption that greenhouse gases stay really high.
Okay, so I'll stop you there. So sort of knowing this under-predictive problem that we have, and knowing that we're using the OPC 2018 data and that there's something coming out soon, did you do any model runs that kind of padded these numbers with like we're going to use more than what the 0.05 number is for mid-century and more than the 17% number is for end of century? Did you do any model runs that added to that to give us a? I mean, we're trending in the
even
wrong
higher.
direction in terms of the predictive value of these data. So,
Yeah. I'll let-
did you do
you
any
wanna talk
model
about
runs
the
that
6.9?
showed us more severe outcomes than
We can
this?
absolutely speak to that. The answer is that these are already padded numbers. They're very conservative,
I don't think they're padded enough.
understanding your points. And also, that we are taking into account that critical infrastructure needs to be treated even more conservatively, so that the very most unlikely, the 0.5%, not 0.05, 0.5% likelihood at end of century, that big 6.9 sea level rise number, we are actually recommending that we do utilize that for planning critical infrastructure in the city. But it is, and these are going to be topics that the advisory committee is going to be grappling with. Is we have data, we have mapping, and we have different sea level rise touch points, and thinking about how we want to use those and for what and when. Our recommendation is that we do use that very high sea level rise number for critical work. So our fire stations, our water treatment plant, our recycling facility, our hospitals, our et cetera, right? But for, a small subdivision or for, a housing development, probably can be treated differently. Not as much risk involved. So a lot of this is grappling with understanding the risk that we're talking about, and where to consider it, and how to create some resiliency with that in mind. And those are the recommendations that we're bringing out today. Please.
So there's two main areas where, because we were grappling with the same question of how do we stay safe enough, where do we go above the state guidance? And so in one location, we went above the state guidance. The state guidance would say that this is the range that's likely. They think we'll see, by mid-century, we'll see between 0.6 feet and 1.1 feet. And we actually did some preliminary models and looked at this number and found this highest amount of sea level rise that the state thinks we'll get by the mid-century, it doesn't actually affect the city very much. We're pretty safe against this. So it was pretty pointless to model it because it doesn't tell us much beyond what we already knew. So what we said was, let's look at, for mid-century, let's only look at the worst case. Let's use this 1.9 feet that the state thinks is very unlikely to happen. So we've added in a safety factor there of 0.8 of a foot of sea level rise. Then the second area where we're exceeding state guidance is the state said for middle of the century, assume global emissions stay very high. And then it said, but for the end of century, you can pick between low emissions scenarios and high emissions scenarios because there is a chance we globally reduce emissions. What we decided for simplicity was to say, no, let's stay safe and let's continue to assume that all the way to the end of century we see very high, continued high global emissions, effectively no cuts in greenhouse gas emissions for the rest of the century. And we used exclusively that high estimate, which gives us this range. Had we used what the state said you can use, which is end of century, we might improve our climate crisis. These numbers drop down considerably. All of them shift down. We ignored that table. We used only the table that plays it safe and says the climate crisis continues to be as bad as we think right now it might be. Does So that's another area where we're exceeding the state guidance. And this isn't the only number we're using. We're also, for certain things, using this 6.9 feet of sea level that the state thinks is very unlikely to happen. So we've added a couple layers of playing it safe.
Real quick, how did the model compare in terms from a validation standpoint to the floods that occurred earlier this year? Okay.
Yeah, we selected those events based on where we have data. And so for the 2005 event, there were a number of gauges. We do have a graphic, I think it's at the end in the appendix that we can show later. I don't want to flip there now, but I was showing the calibration at the Payran Bridge for all three events. It's a very good calibration. No model's perfect. I made that point earlier, but it does really well.
This was after you calibrated it?
We calibrated to the three events with the most data, the most flooding in the city. I think it was 2005, 2017, 2019. We would have loved to go back to like 1982, but there just wasn't data for those. So these were the events where we had data, and the city installed a number of gauges. We were able to use those as well to get some data on the tribs, which we didn't have when we did this last time. So yeah, it's a very good calibration.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, is anyone else getting jealous about all the clapping going on next door? I feel like we should be doing more of that here, no? Okay, so now we're gonna get to the mapping, and before we do, we're gonna have staff go ahead and hand out maps so that you could be looking at it in front of you as we're going through the presentation. We have one for every single table, including for members of the public. We really would love for you to focus your attention on the presentation and only use that as a resource, because we're going to get deep into the conversation here, and we'll have the opportunity to zoom into maps later if needed. You'll also note that the maps are clipped to cardboard because we don't want you to accidentally leave with the maps. Alarms will go off. It'll be crazy, so we recommend you just leave the maps here. And they will be available online to access after the meeting as well. So we're going to wait just a few more seconds to get all the maps on the table, then I'll hand it over to Gina to go to the next section. All right, also, as I warned you, we don't want you to dive into the maps quite yet. We really want to focus on the presentation, so if we can get seated, those maps are really there just for you to be able to look closer once we get into the presentation. But we'd love everyone to get seated and focus their attention here so we could walk you through all the maps in great detail. We were kind of afraid this was going to happen because everyone loves maps, but we decided to do it anyways because we really want you to be able to see it. But members of the public, if you can please also focus your attention here. Everyone take a seat. I'd really appreciate it so we can continue with the presentation.
Yeah. Okay, love this enthusiasm. We've worked a long time on these models and the mapping, and I'm excited to see that there's this level of interest. I know, Darren, you're dying to sit down and listen, right? Thanks, everyone. Sorry to pull you away from those, but we'll have time to dive into those as we talk. I'm going to be showing the maps that are in front of you are also going to be up here, and I'm going to help you read them a little bit, and so that it makes a little more sense to you. The map that is on screen right now is for any of you who know any flood maps, this is probably the only one that you know. And this is the FEMA floodplain map for Petaluma. And I have it up because I just want to iterate that This map has been our flood management guide for over 20 years. It's been updated over the course of those years, but it really has guided our flood management ordinance, our zoning ordinance, policies and planning since 2008. It doesn't account for king tides. It doesn't think about sea level rise. FEMA doesn't do that. FEMA looks at rain and storm, and that's what this good old map does. And it served us well for a long time. So we've talked about it being based on some outdated tech and the fact that it doesn't address all the things that we need to address now with climate change. And so, with that said, finally going to share these new maps and talk about some of those things that we finally can really illustrate, hopefully in a clear way. So the 4 maps that are in your tables are going to be identical to what I'm about to show. And there's a couple reasons why we did this. Might be a mistake, don't know. But a lot of people are much more comfortable just reading a paper map, and we get that. And also, it's a big room, and even though it's a big screen, it's going to be hard to see detail, and we understand that too. So you'll be able to reference back and forth. There are 4 maps in front of you. There's 2 for mid-century, and there's 2 for late century. And as Sebastian has, I think, articulated pretty well, the reason why we have 2 maps, one of them is sea level rise on top of rain and storm, and the other is sea level rise on top of king tide. And so we have those 2 maps for both mid and late century. And I think with that, I'm going to bring up the first of these maps. This is our mid-century sea level rise map with 1.9 feet showing on top of our rain and storm surge. And I'm going to walk you through how to read this map. Later on, I'm going to zoom in, and we have some on-screen larger scale versions where we can focus in a little bit tighter. So bear with me. I know that it's going to be hard to read and hard to make out detail. So this map shows the areas, again, that have a 1% chance of flooding every year if we have 1.9 feet of sea level rise. And you see the combined effect here. It's the combined areas of storm, surge, rainfall, flooding, and sea level rise. They don't happen on the same day, storm surge and rainfall, that 1% chance, but they have the same chance of happening every year. Again, I'm just reiterating what Sebastian's already drilled down into. So the city outline, how do I point this guy? This guy. So the city outline is here in, it kind of looks pink or red, but it's actually an orange line here, and if you see it on your maps, it should look orange. Major roads are in black. Here's Lakeville Highway coming into town. What else? Here's the turning basin, downtown Petaluma here, Schollenberger Park here, water recycling facility here. Here's the river wandering through. This is McNair Peninsula right here. Coming on up, let's see, here's East Washington coming through right next to downtown, heading out to Bodega. You notice that this map shows a lot of flood. The flood again is the darker the blue, the deeper the water. A lot of this is not in town. So I want to make sure you kind of pay attention to that city boundary. This is our watershed at the northwest side, the northwest of town. This is county here. And then here's Redwood Highway at 101, where we do have significant flooding historically. And is there anything else I should say? I should talk a little bit about the flood colors. So there's a legend. Oops. There's a legend down here, And you'll see the yellow is our shallowest flooding. And I think that's less than half a foot. And then the next color here is the salmon color, and that is, 1 foot deep. And then we go into the blue colors. And now, now we're getting into this is, really significant flooding, anywhere from 2 to 5 feet in the blues. And then anything deeper than 5 foot of flood is shown in this green color. So over here at Schollenberger, which makes sense. It's a, tidal marsh over there. So you see it down here south. This is south of town down here, but you see it down here too. See a little bit of it up here. Again, this is mid-century sea level rise with rain and storm. I think the other takeaway, or if there's a takeaway real quickly from this, is that this map shows us that the areas that have a 1% chance of flooding really are largely from are from the bottom of town here up, and then really after the Washington Street Bridge and the creeks, we don't really see that sea level rise is causing any extra flooding during these rain events. And when we zoom in on this in a few minutes, you'll see that a little bit better. I'm going to go to the next map, and it should correspond to the second map that you all have in front of you. And this is the mid-century map, again with the 1.9 foot of sea level rise, and now it's overlain with the king tide. So this map shows king tide and what that would look like after we have 1.9 foot of sea level rise. Again, a very low probability by mid-century. You'll notice that you only see the yellow, blue, and green flooding in the creeks and wetlands. There's a couple of new breakout areas. Where are they? They're kind of hard to see actually in this map, but there's a couple in here. And maybe some more over in here, some of these lighter shades. And remember, again, that unlike the previous map, with king tide, we know this king tide is going to happen every year. We're going to get hit with king tides at least twice, if not more, during the course of a year. The fuzzy part, as it is in all of these maps, is the sea level rise because of the predictive nature of that data. I'm going to go to the next map. This will be your third map. And this is an end of century map. And this shows 3.4 feet of sea level rise. And this is with rain and storm, again, with the 1% chance of occurring every year. This is the largest amount of sea level rise, again, that the state thinks will likely happen by the end of the century. It also assumes global greenhouse gas emissions don't go down at all, and that we do nothing to prepare for floods. And by that, I mean these maps don't take into account any projects that the city might embark upon and implement between now and the end of the century to start mitigating and start building resiliency. So this is assuming today's conditions, infrastructure-wise, with some very unlikely and dire sea level rise at the end of the century. Again, the yellow shaded areas are less than half a foot of flooding. The salmon is a foot deep, or between a half a foot and a foot. And then again, light blue to dark blue goes from 2 to 5 feet, and that dark green is more than 5 foot of water. So this map shows us more flooding, more flooded areas, and most importantly, it's taught us that 3.4 feet of sea level rise only changes the flood model from the bottom end of the city up to about the Payran Bridge. And upriver from there and up the creeks, This amount of sea level rise doesn't result in additional flooding during a rain event or storm surge. The impacts from the tides just don't affect those areas upriver to the same extent that they do below that point. And then I'm going to advance to the last of the 4 maps. This is the last of your bottom map. And this is end of century sea level rise, again, 3.4 feet. But now we look at the king tide with that sea level rise. Again, the highest tides of the year, and what those might look like at the end of century. You'll notice, again, some new areas of flooding, particularly down in here around First Street, we see more, and also over on Lakeville. So seeing this is starting to get inundated here too. We don't see new flooding moving very far upriver, and we don't see new flooding from the creeks coming down, which makes sense because this doesn't show the rainfall effects. This is king tide effects. So let's zoom in a little bit, and the next maps I'm going to show you are zooming into that area of the city where sea level rise from what you've seen. I've mentioned that we're not seeing effects much north of Payran at all, and not really much between East Washington and Payran for that matter. And so we've clipped the map so we could zoom in and share it at a larger scale, and kind of focusing in on that area where sea level rise has more influence. And so I'm going back to the beginning now. This is back to that first map you looked at, and it's a zoomed in view of that first map. And again, this is 1% chance of flood and 1% chance of storm surge, taken with 1.9 foot of sea level rise at mid-century. And some additional areas shown to be subject to flooding beyond what we currently know to be at flood risk during 100-year rain or storm surge right now. And so if you were to put this up against our FEMA map that we have now, the flood insurance rate map, you'll start to see some subtle but some differences. I think we'll also see that yes, in many cases we have more areas inundated, but in some cases, even at the 1.9, I think we have some that have come out of the floodplain. Is that true? I think so, yeah. And those are up in the north end of town, actually around Industrial, I think. So, so this is a zoom in, and I'm not sure. Again, for orientation, the orange line is our city limits, and downtown Turning Basin is here. And let's see here. Here's Lakeville coming in. Here's 101 at Lakeville. We're seeing definitely some flooding here on the boulevard. Let's see, where's the boulevard? Here's the boulevard here. This is First Street here. Yeah. And we're seeing a little bit up here. And a few more areas you might see up in here too that don't show up on the current flood maps. And I'm going to move to the next zoom map. This is your second map, and it's zoomed in the same area. And now we have king tide with that 1.9 sea level rise. And again, very low probability by mid-century that we're going to see this level of sea rise, but the king tides are certainly 100% predictable, and we know those are there. And, we could start to see more significant impacts during our king tides for sure, and I think this illustrates that. You're seeing what looks to me like 4 to 5 feet at Schollenberger. You're starting to see some out of bank flows here along that dark blue purple along the river as you come into town. And I'm going to forward to the next end of century map zoomed in. This is end of century, 3.4 feet of sea level rise, and this is with rain and storm surge, the 100-year event, the 1% probability. And significantly more areas are flooded, particularly along First Street, Second Street, Lakeville. Let me get you over there. Here's First, here's Second, here's Petaluma Boulevard. And then Lakeville there's Lakeville coming in. Starting to see some flooding in here. The effect of this amount of sea level rise on the flood dissipates around the Payram Bridge. Again, it's why we went in tight on these views. So you're not going to see anything past there in these zoom views. This is the map which we're proposing would guide most of the general plan effort. For certain effect or certain development like critical infrastructure that we've talked about with high threat to human safety, the higher sea level rise predictions are proposed to be used. And then the last zoom in is, again, the last map on your table. This is end of century with 3.4 feet of sea level rise and on top of king tide. And more areas are shown inundated here. Remember, this flooding would happen 2 to 3, maybe 4 times a year at king tides. The reason why I'm fuzzy on the number of times it happens, it happens at the equinox. There is usually one super high tide, but there will be a couple over 2 or 3 days where, the next day's tide, it's still really high. It's still just maybe 1/10 of a foot less than the worst of the king tide. So if I sound fuzzy and, vague about the number of times it happens, the worst ones happen, the very, very highest happen twice a year. But right next to them at the equinoxes, there will be some adjacent tides on those days and surrounding days where they'll get super high. So that's why we talk about it in terms of it can happen a few times a year. Let's see. Again, no rainfall on this map. This is just king tide with sea level rise. Most of the flooding above 1 foot of depth is confined to roads for the most part here. So to summarize the maps, we should remember we've selected an amount of sea level rise that have a very low probability of happening. The maps show areas that could flood in the future, and they don't consider global emissions changing, that the rate of GHG gases is unchanged at the end of century. What else do I want to say about this? We feel these are conservative assumptions and give us a good factor of safety, which engineers love, and I'm an engineer, so I love that. And I also will reiterate what I'd said in answer to a question earlier about updating the maps. As we get better and more guidance in the future, we will be revisiting these and updating these to make sure that we are realistic and staying current with latest science. These maps show what might flood if we do nothing over the decades to prepare for the future. Again, a conservative assumption, not just in terms of that factor of safety I was talking about, but also in terms of the fact that, if I have anything to do with it, and most of the people in this room, there will be projects identified and implemented around the city to address the higher risk areas and to start planning ahead. It's what we're all here for and what we're here to start talking about. So these maps don't anticipate any new resiliency, no new flood projects on the creeks and rivers. And again, more conservative assumptions that we've layered on to what we think are already conservative assumptions. So the intent is to use these as one of the tools to guide the city as we move forward over the next 3/4 of a century. Just a little time frame there. And it's a lot to absorb. And I think, are we at a breaking point for clarifying questions? We're gonna have Brian just talk about. Oh, Brian, I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you.
Just a quick note, I see some photos being taken. I just want to mention the maps are online. They print out really nicely, 11 by 17. If you know who to ask, you could probably even get something printed out at City Hall. So did everyone find their favorite restaurant and where they live on these maps? Come on. Okay, we're definitely going to get there. So just a quick reminder, this is the intro, right? There's a lot to absorb, more to come. You know, if you are like me, like last night or early this morning, your head will start spinning at 3 a.m. just thinking about life and all sorts of things. But just a quick reminder, and we're going to turn to just a Q&A after this, but just the fact that this is the intro, starting point. We're going to move into at a follow-up General Plan Advisory Committee meeting. What do? Right? We have this data. We understand the risks. We're wanting to calculate the risks from a policy perspective. How do we apply this to our general plan? How do we apply this to projects in the near future? And then that's going to set us up really nicely to talk about land use alternatives. So we have a really robust land use, throughout the city. This is our opportunity to, think differently, understand the impacts of future flooding and sea level rise and how we should adapt to that as a community from a land use perspective. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Dave.
Thank you all. So we know we just gave you a lot more information to think about. I'm just going to note that we might potentially go a little bit over 9. We're going to hope to keep us on track. We're a little bit over now because we want to give enough time for you all to ask questions and members of the public. But we're going to start now with GPAC. If you have any questions or comments of what you've heard, I imagine you will, and we'll go ahead and dive into that now. Then members of the public, as a reminder, I'm going to ask you to queue up at the mic after that and let us know if you have any comments as well, and then we'll come back to GPAC after that. So go ahead, we'll start with, please remember to say your name. Mary, over to you.
Hi, this is Mary Dooley. On the mapping, is the consideration of regular tides in an incident, say on the first one, which is storm and rain flooding with storm surge, does that also take into consideration regular high tide? Since that's a 9-foot fluctuation from low tide to high tide, I thought that might be important.
Oh, okay. I don't think we need to go there, but yeah, to answer your question, for the 100-year rainfall, the assumption we're assuming is the mean higher high water. So we call that the high tide. It's the mean of all those high tides during the year. We added sea level rise to that. So for the mid-century, we added 1.9 feet to that value. So it was 6.35 plus the 1.9. That's what the model is using. Mm-hmm.
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Sharon Kirk, and I probably could have asked this earlier in the first round of questions, but is there any consideration of river dredging, or is that impact so minor that it's a non-event, or does it have an impact?
Yeah, the model does include the latest dredging data from the Corps of Engineers, just to get the hydraulics of the channel in there correctly. But yeah, if the sediment piles up, there would be more flooding.
So that should be a consideration then, the frequency and funding for ongoing dredging.
Correct. It's important to keep the dredging going.
Thank you.
Phil Boyle. I just wanted to clarify. It seemed like a couple times the statement was made that intense or the 1% rain, the 1% storm doesn't happen at the same time as the storm surge. Is that a correct statement? Or did I hear?
Yeah, so the conditions that make a 1% rainfall event, which is mostly those big atmospheric rivers, those happen at those are different factors than the conditions that make a 1% storm surge. And well, unfortunately, there's not a lot of research. There's some research that's been done in the Bay Area to try and see what's the chance that during that 100-year rainfall, you also get some storm surge coming upriver from the bay. Because there's a chance, right? And some jurisdictions, I'm thinking of Marin County, really went into this to try and figure out how much storm surges do we think will happen at the same time as a 100-year rainstorm. And it turns out to be a really complicated statistical question because there's some amount of storm surge, but how much? We know that the chances of a 100-year rainfall happening at the same time as a 100-year storm surge, the chances of that are just really low, comically low. We're talking it's not a 1% chance, we're talking some fraction. So one of the ways that this model deals with this issue that we're not considering, might there be a 5-year storm surge during that 100-year rainfall? Might there be a little bit of storm surge while the rain is falling? One of the way that's addressed is the model was built with our current understanding of the tides, and it was tested, and the model was run with that high tide, not with high tide plus some storm surge. It was just run with that high tide. And the calibration says that's actually a really accurate way of doing it. The model said, even though we're not factoring in the extra bit of storm surge, the model makes a flood that looks like the floods we know happen, even those really big floods. And part of that is probably because when you're doing the flood model, this rain takes a whole day to happen, right? And the tide goes up and down twice during that. So in the real world, that rain's coming down and sometimes it's fighting a high tide and sometimes it's fighting a low tide, and it's real easy for it to get out. The model is saying, ignore the times when it's easy for the water to get out. Let's play it safe and say the tide is always high. It's always hard for that water to get out. And so one, that simplifies the modeling process. It makes it 20 times faster, so we're able to do more experimentation. And the other one is, it's the safe bet. You don't hope the rain happens during a low tide. You say, we're just gonna assume, pretend it's high tide for the whole day. And that seems to capture that, the potential influence of a little bit of storm surge, because we're already bumping up that tide level to, it's not actually the high tide, it's the higher of the high tides, because there's 2 tides every day and one's a little bit more, and that's the one we're looking at.
So maybe
and those also factor in storm surge. Sorry, those measurements of that really high tide of that day through the year, some of those high tides happened during a storm surge. So we captured the storm surge inside that measurement. So it is
maybe
built
I
in.
don't understand the definition of storm surge. Is a storm surge created by a storm?
Yes, but not rain. It's different than, there's the rain event that's dropping water, and then there's the storm surge off the coast that's forcing huge swells into the San Francisco Bay, and there's waves pushing from the South Bay up into San Pablo Bay up the river. That's the storm surge. And there's an El Nino, so the entire Pacific is high. That's a storm surge.
Okay, anyone else? And again, I'm going to remind members of the public, if you did have a comment, if you wouldn't mind actually bringing your comment card up if you have it filled out, just so we know how many questions there might be coming up. Any other members of GPAC questions? Yes, let's get the mic over here. Oh, we're going to actually we're not done with GPAC yet, I'm sorry. I'm just going to bring your cards up, and then we'll ask you to come up to the mic as members of the public. I want to give you enough warning. We're going to go right here. Yep. Remember to say your names, please.
Oh, Bill Reinhardt. Just a quick one. Just noticing that the flooding depths are pretty much concentrated in the corridors and the streets. And I'm trying to discern is the topographic model that was used, is that the ground plane, or are buildings assumed to be, are we looking at the building forms, or are we looking at the ground plane? Is it the fact that the mid-blocks are not flooded, is it because the building forms are in the model, or is it because they're the pads are higher?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the county LiDAR data, and they call it a bare earth topography, where they try to take out structures and buildings. So it's meant to be the ground level. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions from the GPAC before we go to public comment? Wow, that fantastic presentation, I guess. Great, so we're going to take this time now for members of the public to be able to ask their questions. And I'm going to ask you, Dwayne, I think I saw your card. If you want to come up to this mic, please, that's going to be there in a second. And then I'll ask the rest of you, if you did have questions as well, to queue up. And I think we had Dwayne coming up, and then we'll go to you next.
Hi.
You could state your name, please.
Yeah, sorry, David Airy. I live on Peyran Street, near the river. Thanks for all this fantastic information. I'm curious, and have been for some time, about the relationship between the kind of maps that you're showing here, which I guess are put together by the city, and the FEMA maps, which guide the insurance for homeowners, and how those interrelate. If we're taking the FEMA information for the insurance, which I understand we are, is that drawn from city information, or does FEMA come and make their own judgments about these things? And how is that, if they do, how does that feed into the city's information that we're seeing? Thanks.
Looks like we have an answer for you here. Here you go.
Thank you. It is a great question. Thank you very much for asking. I'm Pam Tuft. I'm the CRS coordinator for the city of Petaluma. I handle the FEMA compliance requirements for the city, and also work on designing mitigation projects and getting them funded and implemented. The FEMA map stands alone. So the city is very proactive. It is a snapshot in time, and that's what FEMA hangs their hat on. And it is updated through letter of map revisions or letter of map amendment to address specific parcels or neighborhoods or areas that are improved. And a case in point would be Denman Reach, when we did the flood terraces to widen out the river and allow less flooding of structures along Industrial Avenue. So you can amend the map to reflect that change. But it doesn't change until the city asks FEMA to change it. So all the effort that was presented tonight is to guide the General Plan Advisory Committee and the community in being more proactive in our general plan. That we didn't have these tools when we did the last general plan that was adopted in 2008. So now we are stepping forward and saying we need to know more about what's happening, what's going to happen in the future, so we can protect, we can be more resilient, we can design those projects, and we could allow development that is maintained in a safe manner. So the FEMA map is our next work effort, and it will be running concurrently as the general plan gets developed and adopted. It is about a 2-year process. The conversion of our XP Storm model to HEC-RAS was the first step. The next step is we, again, will work with West Consultants and submit all of our data to FEMA for what is called preliminary review. They will offer us comments. We might do some manipulations or modifications, corrections according to what they want, and then we will go through a whole community outreach effort to get the community involved in the remapping. And then we will submit that to FEMA and obtain approval through FEMA of a revised map. And that will become the document that is reflected in the general plan and the zoning ordinance. And as soon as that's effective, we embrace that, and we might have stricter regulations, which we already do. We do more than FEMA is minimally required. And this general plan, I assume, the general plan that you're working on now will be even more restrictive, as was discussed with that area that's going to be affected by SLR at the end of century. Those of us, most of us in this room, will probably not be here to see that end of century. But if we start now, we can become more resilient. We can implement projects. We can work more studiously as a community to reduce our greenhouse gases. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank
Could
you.
I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure. I mean, we typically like, if that's okay with Dwayne, I know you're the only other person waiting, so sure, go ahead.
I'm curious, in terms of, since the Army Corps of Engineers did the work on Payran with the flood protection, did they then say this is going to be the new flooding situation after this work, or was that assessed by somebody else at that point, or by FEMA or the city?
The $45 million project that was built in cooperation with the city, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Sonoma Water was designed to handle the improved capacity and flow velocity, the speed at which the water does. The transition weir, the constriction weir that some people call the dam at the upstream end, was solely to replicate the historic movement of water. So it's got the wall and the notch. If any of you who live in the Payran area lived before the Corps project, you remember it was this choked little thing. Most of the properties owned just to the middle of the river, and it flooded on a regular basis, sometimes up to the eaves of those on Jess Avenue. So the intent was to not change the characteristics of water above or below, but protect that neighborhood. So that project was done with the intent. And when we did that EIR for that project and then built it, that EIR guided the last general plan, and which is why the existing general plan calls for a river corridor upstream of that weir of 400 feet, to the extent feasible and possible, to allow us to do flood terraces, to help widen the river in other reaches. So those types of projects and studies will guide policies that occur or are adopted and enforced after a project. So that project was really pivotal on guiding the policies and development scenarios that were allowed and identified in the existing general plan, the 2025 plan.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pam. And thank you so much, Dwayne, for your patience. If you want to state your name.
Yeah, Dwayne Bellinger. And just to quickly follow up on the Payran issue, it seems to me that the keeping water to the north end of town, keeping the Denman and keeping it out of the Payran area, it would be really wise to follow the Irish example of building a series of small dams, very small ones the fish can jump up, to recharge our water more so than to prevent flooding. Flooding we can live with. Running out of drinking water is very difficult. So I would suggest damming the whole Denman area, condemning it, taking the land by eminent domain, and building a water preservation place up there that's water preservation in the winter and farmland in the summer. The suggestion that we could buy land, we could move the people. It just irritates me that we would have actually built a place at Leisure Lake instead of just building a lake there, that people would invest their life savings in housing. And it's also true that many of the housing in the other mobile home parks go underwater during a flood. And it's as a general rule that the poorest among us will be the ones that suffer most from global warming. And I'd like to see us not do that in Petaluma. In 2008, I came to the city council and I brought a map, a geodetic survey map. I marked everything under 10 feet in blue, posted it on the wall, and I suggested that the city council not allow building anything below 10 feet. Now, I expected a compromise at 5, but the city would not be in any way impoverished if, like the park in New York City, if we had a park all the way through the downtown area and didn't allow any building at all. At this point, 6.9 feet. There is going to be no money available 50 years from now to build more housing for the people who get flooded out. What are you going to do, put them all in tents? It's just absurd that we would allow building at 6.9. I'd like you as members to think about that and think about how we can plan a city where we have parks and farmland right to where the river is and build houses back, move them back 500 yards. If that means you have to move the urban growth boundary back 500 yards to have the same number of people, that's fine. But why are we building it all on this waterway? I suggested when they built the sewer treatment plant, and you see 1/3 of the sewer treatment plant's going to go underwater. What do you do after a big flood and a sewer treatment's underwater? I mean, you plan for this and you build them at higher levels. It doesn't make any sense financially to not build above the 6.9 feet. I would point out one other thing, just for fun of it, 2 things. One, there are scientists who say that the alignment of the Earth, Moon, and Sun is, of course, related to the king tides. And I've sat at where they put the chess sets in and watched the king tide come up above the drainage ditches from the roads to within 2 feet of the height of the railroad there. And if we're going to get 1.9 feet, we're going to be able to. The water will be right up to where the railroad is now. That doesn't make a lot of sense to build anything in that area. I would suggest also that there are scientists around that correlate the Earth, Moon, Sun alignment with earthquakes, and I don't know whether that's true or not. But when the moon is right above, especially when it's the closest in its orbit to us, it raises the cloud level, causing more rain. So you not only get a surge, and I would like the gentleman here to tell us that there is no correlation between the 300-year floods that have happened during my lifetime, and and the correlation that none of those happened during a full moon, during a king tide. Is there's not a correlation. There's, of course, floods that weren't during that time, but were there the main floods during that time? And one other thing I would mention, this woman is worried about notice. If we have an earthquake and it, where Robin Williams of Brock is there, where the highway goes underneath the mountain to San Francisco, if that piece of rock slides down that cliff into the bay, we might see, not a storm surge, we might see a tsunami coming all the way up to here. But that's my brother's worry, that's not mine. My worry is lack of drinking water. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. And just want to note that we are taking detailed notes of all the input that's being gathered, and that'll be included in a summary. Yes, why don't you go ahead and step up to, or if it's easier for you, we could bring it to you. What would you prefer? We can bring a mic to you if that's easier for you. No? Okay. No problem. Take your time. Welcome. All right. So just a reminder for GPAC, it looks like we're going to have one more public comment, and I'll come back to you all if you had any final thoughts or questions.
Hi there. My name is Nicola Fry, and I live in Petaluma. I've lived here for the last 70 years. And I have one question. When you did your models, did it take into account the adjustment that's happened since the wall was built along the freeway? Because I know there was a flood caused by the wall, and I'm assuming that's probably an engineering problem. But my property backs up to that wall, and I have given myself a portal out my back fence, and I track the flooding out that there. And I'm wondering if that was taken into account when you did your models. Because it is drastically changed since before the wall was built.
It's a great question. Thanks for asking that. We're scratching our heads. We know that the LiDAR data that we have from the county did it predate the 101 widening is the question. And we have to check. I'm not sure. I don't know the date from the data versus the completion of the wall. It's pretty recent.
Yeah.
And if that data is more than, 9 months old, then it wouldn't have taken that into account.
Yeah, I'm a retired engineer, and so I have
Yeah.
tracking devices out my back wall as to how high the water is and what it does. And the tide fluctuations and everything are accounted with my data. But yeah, it has dramatically changed what happened.
Interesting. Well, we'll look into that further. We'll take a look at it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you again for that comment, and we'll grab that comment card from you before we leave here today. So GPAC, back to you now. Any final questions or thoughts? And miraculously, it looks like we might actually get out of here earlier than I thought. And we'll have plenty of time to think about this as we come back together again. Looks like we do have some hands up. Let's go ahead and start with Ileana. We haven't heard from you yet. And then we'll get questions from others. Please remember to state your name.
Ileana Madrigal, I have a question because I see the city limits, right? So we're working for the general plan for the city. But for all the housing that is out of limits, will our plan could make a recommendation to the county general plan so we can protect all the area that it's not included into the city? I was just thinking about that. Like, will that be also included for the out of the city limits?
So that's a great question. It is the data that we use for our models is from the county. The county has the same information, and they're undergoing a similar general plan update, as I understand it. So they will be grappling with some of these same issues, and yeah, they have these flood models. That was one of the beautiful things of kind of a real plus for us when we moved to this new model, because it's the same model that the county uses. And so their watershed and everything outside of the city, their model talks to our model right at that boundary between the county and the city. And so now it expanded the capacity of our understanding tremendously, and we share that information. Thanks.
Great question. Yep, we'll go here and then over to you, Roberto.
Thank you. Just curious about your...
If you could just quickly state your name, sorry.
My name is Bill Reinhardt. Thanks. I talk too much. I thought I'd said it enough. You mentioned that upstream of Payran or so, the sea level rise doesn't really have such great effect. Just wondering what's your interpretation of the new data compared to like the old data? I mean, are we finding that upstream flooding, it looks pretty drastic up here, but is it what we expected, or is it just in general?
Yeah, the impact of the tide, that tidal zone isn't really changing. So adding sea level rise, the sea level rise portion is kind of just upstream of the turning basin, and that's about where it peters out. And the rest of what you see in the map is the rainfall, the 100-year rainfall.
And I guess my question is, how does that jive with previous modeling for rainfall upstream?
Yeah, they're similar. There's differences though, but just the difference in the models. The 2D really does allow a better understanding of where it goes when it gets out of bank. There's higher vegetation in the creeks than was previously assumed, so that was incorporated into the model based on recent observations.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go, actually, Yeah, Roberto, we'll go to you next, and then we'll go to Aaron, if that's okay. Yep. And sorry for being annoying about saying your name every time. It's just for the recording mainly, because they can't really see you all. So if we could just get in the habit.
Yeah, I'm Roberto. So I have a clarifying question and then a follow-up. Did you mention that you used the LiDAR data and then you removed the buildings and create a level floodplain, and that's how you kind of base your analysis from, versus keeping existing kind of building infrastructure in place when the modeling is done? I wasn't sure if I heard that correctly.
I'm going to show the terrain model. There we go. Yeah, so LiDAR is a fancy acronym. It's lasers in the air, and they scan the ground, and they build this really detailed model of the shape. And so you'll look at, there's little features in here, really minor stuff that starts showing up, like the old slipways. See those straight lines there? And you'll see somebody's yard is pretty high there next compared to the neighbors. You even see that the road is maybe a foot lower. So the LiDAR is going to grab everything that's down to the surface. It'll grab the street, it'll grab the sidewalk, it'll grab the yard, and then when it sees a building, that data was processed, and they basically scrape off the building, and they basically make an average from the side yard to the side yard, the front yard to the backyard, and they say that's probably where the building floor is. And so this is where there's a limitation of these sorts of models, that it might say, okay, this blue area is getting real close to the door, but the data that this LiDAR doesn't know that your floor is a foot higher than your front step. It doesn't know that. And so the really detailed building-specific impact requires some site-specific measurements, and FEMA has a process for that, which is, again, FEMA's totally separate than this process. But it means that's a discrepancy. If you look at this and you see blue at the house, it's not a guarantee that the water's on the first floor. The data doesn't know how high the first floor is. It's guessing based on the yards and the driveway.
Yeah, because my follow-up was going to be, how do you, I guess, what is like your margin for that, for not accounting for the height, and how that takes into consideration how the floodplain might actually be, wider, I guess, from a 2D perspective of impact and depth?
So is the question, since the model doesn't think there's a building there, the model assumes you can send water right through the building when we know it'll have to go around.
Yeah, I mean, like you average it out, but, we're talking about we're building new multi-family buildings that are way taller, right? So it's kind of taking up the volume where you would normally have normal flow to go, but it actually has to run up further, right?
Yeah, I think I'm going to lean on you. So if I can interpret the question, it's since this model thinks there's no building there in the way of the flood, it basically just thinks there's a foundation there. Does the model account for that flood water going through the area has to go around the building? So there's a question about the model, and then there's another question about building standards. And that's actually one of the things about building in floodplains. There are rules about this. You're not allowed to, by regulations, kind of prevent you from, when you put in a building, preventing floodwaters going underneath it. That's actually if you were to go and build a house now, there are actually restrictions on.
Yeah, I mean, I just guess just from a flooding perspective, right? If we're talking about, wide spans of building infrastructure that's in the way of your fluid flow, and then you got 2 feet of water, you have some air propagation that's not being accounted for. And so, something to look into. And then my last one, I guess, when you talk about, I think it was the high tide or king tide, I think you were talking about king tide, you said you kept it at a steady state where it remained constant, and so you're assuming that it's just additional rainflow that's going into, I guess, almost like a static fluid. But what are some of the requirements that go into in the motions from high tide to low tide when developing and designing requirements to account for the infrastructure change? Because now you have different forces acting on whatever we might make, from like negative pressure and just, that kind of stuff. So just out of curiosity.
Sorry, I didn't quite follow how infrastructure affects the title, if you could
So,
repeat that.
When designing a mitigation plan for what we're looking at now, right, the assumption is that we're holding this tide constant, right? There's no flow from high to low. It's just we're considering a king tide, for example, and based off that, that's how the mapping is done. My question is, when we align requirements to design for mitigation plan, do we use that same approach in terms of from, I guess, an infrastructure and resiliency standpoint, and or do we use like the shift of high tide and low tide and how that might impact our design to mitigate the flooding that may occur? Because that's a whole different kind of force that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I'm thinking of an example of that is the water recycling facility was studied a couple of years ago. How could it be affected by sea level rise? They did a really zoomed in look because some of the predictions said, wow, those lower ponds could flood. How do they flood? Well, it's because the way they were modeled, it wasn't water going over the top of the dam, going over the berm and falling into the pond. It was water going through on the side of that pond. There's a pipe to let the pond water out, right? Water's going through that pipe and get into the pond. And so that says, well, there's actually a way we can deal with that. We can, when the tide is really high, put a valve on that and stop the water going backwards. And then when the tide goes out, open it up and let the water out. So when you get into project-specific adaptations, you definitely can definitely zoom in a little bit more on the specifics of the site to factor in the thing like, is there a building in the way that might change our understanding of the flood? Or is there a way that we're not considering the really accurate tide scenario?
Just another clarification to your first question about the buildings and the topography. So the bare earth topography strips them out as we've described, but in the model, we actually include the building footprint and we give it a high roughness value to account for the water. If it is in the building, it would go very slowly. And so the hydraulics around it will rise as a result.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Okay, Aaron, thank you so much for your patience. Over to you next.
I guess I couldn't not be curious. Aaron Chmielewski, will we be talking in future sections about the intersection of the watershed health and like future potential river infrastructure that we may already know of and how that impacts?
That was a long walk just to say yes. So part of the, we're doing a comprehensive update to the general plan. That also is going to compel us to look at, every other, planning effort that we've done. So whether it's river access and enhancement, I think the bottom line is whether it's within one of the elements of the general plan, right? There's one that will be focused on natural resources, transportation, land use, climate. I mean, I don't know how we don't address it, how it impacts different communities through an environmental justice lens. So all that to say, yes, and as part of the GPAC, you'll be front seat to that discussion. I'm just going to stay here.
Brendel. So my comment and recommendation for moving forward is to we've got a couple of years before finalizing the general plan. I think it's important to allow for flexibility to adapt and if these sea level rise estimates change as a result of newly issued state guidance, then we plug those numbers into the model and rerun and use those maps. So we have maps that reflect the best data available. I'm a bit concerned we're using 5-year-old data already in these maps.
Yeah, so I think just 2 points to that. We actually, if we're trying to complete the general plan by the end of 25, there's actually a smaller window where there's different ways to look at it. And so this is something that we would be taking to council over the next handful of months just to gauge our electeds, our various bodies like the Planning Commission. So where there is that flexibility, yes. I think the second thing I would just mention is I think what we're starting to see is a lot of jurisdictions, rather than wait 20, 25 years to update a general plan, as necessary, as needed, making much more focused updates every 5 years, every 7 years. So that's something that we're also looking forward to as part of a strategy for this general plan.
Thanks. Chris Rebelo, just a question. These maps are great. Would it be possible for those of us on the GPAC to borrow them on occasion? I'm just thinking before the next meeting, I'd love to get casually together with some folks here, just so, we can really look at them, because I'm not an expert. I want to get together with people who really know this stuff and can help me understand it. So is that a possibility?
Yes, so these maps are, they're on the website, on our GPAC website now, and so you could print them out, on any size. These we would like to keep. I think that was sort of the instruction. If there's interest to access more maps, just send me an email.
Okay. And then the final thing is, this was perfect. I can't imagine not doing this in person, but I personally really like the in-person meetings. I think, the energy's greater. As much as I love to sit in my recliner at home with my cat on my lap, it's like, I can't imagine. It's much easier to focus and be engaged in an in-person manner. So just my recommendation going forward.
Thank you.
Okay, Bill Reinhardt again. Just one last thing. This information's been a long time coming and highly anticipated, and I just want to say I think you all have done a fantastic job in making it accessible and understandable. I couldn't imagine. I was really intimidated by all, the data up front, but I think you did a beautiful job. So thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Should we end it on that awesome note? Yeah, that was perfectly done. We didn't even plant that. That actually happened naturally. So I think with that, unless there's any other comments from the team, we're going to go ahead and end it. Just a reminder, we're going to do this virtually, very similar presentation to the community on the 27th. We welcome you all to attend that as well, to hear from them, and we hope to see you all again in person soon. Have a fantastic night. Hey, just quick note, there's a lot of food left. If you would like to help yourself, there's to-go containers to take it home with you. Please do. Thank you.